Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest, thorniest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about all over the data center ecosystem, among digital infrastructure and critical facilities, regardless of whether your company is in the business of being a data center operator, a technology or a facilities related company, or does something related to construction, real estate, or investment, or perhaps you work in some facet of outsourced sales and marketing services within data centers, digital infrastructure, or critical facilities. But regardless of what your company does, if you're trying to level up, if you're trying to grow your impact, your team's influence, your company's growth trajectory, you're for sure in the right place, regardless of what your role is on the go-to-market team. Perhaps you work in sales, account management, customer success, marketing, like as an account executive or as a sales development rep, a business development rep, an AE, an SDR, or BDR, or perhaps you work in some facet of product management or channel partnerships, or maybe you're the executive sponsor, the leader, the one who's responsible for recruiting all of the right people, making sure that they're in the right roles and the right functions on the right teams, playing their musical instruments just at the right tempo, at the right speed, at the right volume, rowing their boat all in the right direction. If you are serious about taking your business to the next level in this amazing period of growth in the data center ecosystem, you are in for a real treat. If this is the first time you're joining us for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, welcome. If this is your second time or you're a frequent flyer, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox every Sunday. You can sign up, you can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what's on the agenda for this week? First, we're going to talk about how a high-speed internet and connectivity provider addresses changing marketing and sales strategy. Then we'll shift gears and get into how a data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure firm aligns content and value for ideal client needs. After that, we'll turn our attention to how a data center conference events company attracts the right clients. Then we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center infrastructure support and optimization company improves its name recognition. Then how a wholesale data center provider can differentiate. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll look at how to create a unique hyperscale data center market position. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question, which is, how does a high-speed internet and connectivity provider address changing marketing and sales strategy? That's a fantastic question. And there's two places that I would start. So your company is like operating in the traditional ISP, internet service provider, telecommunications kind of model. So you likely spend a lot of time talking with your clients and talking with your partners about things like IXs, internet exchanges, meet me rooms, carrier neutrality, how to provide a more competitive portfolio of options within specific carrier hotels, within specific co-location facilities. So with all of that in mind, let's think about first, to orient ourselves, where are we within the data center ecosystem? Well, a high-speed internet and connectivity provider is a type of telecommunications company, and telecommunications company sits within the technology parts of the data center ecosystem. So it sits side by side with its first cousins and things like hardware, software, storage, application monitoring, cybersecurity. Over at DCSMI, we catalog 22 different kinds of data center technologies that are relevant to people in and around the data center ecosystem. It sits next to the part of the ecosystem that deals with data center facilities, and it's incredibly relevant to data center operators. Actually, data center operators may be the biggest core part of the addressable market of the ideal client profile for this kind of business. In terms of the construction, real estate, and investment part of the data center ecosystem, probably only loosely related to that, although for sure there are some benefits in building good relationships with data center developers and construction and investors, because if you're able to get in early to these facilities, you can for sure have a first mover advantage. A lot of the big telecommunications companies have C-level executives or vice presidents or leaders that focus on just development. In other words, not business development, but development of getting their telecommunications lines, getting their fiber into the right kinds of facilities that can have an exponential impact on their company's growth. So what does it mean to have a changing marketing and sales strategy? It's a great time to be asking that question, because if we were talking about this 10 years ago, we know that data center facilities, with all of the demands with artificial intelligence, high performance computing, a huge premium on edge for governance reasons and for latency reasons with latency sensitive applications. But if we were having this talk like 10 years ago, buyer preferences were very different than they are today. 10 years ago, you could count on the fact that most of your prospects, most of your clients would do a fair amount of research on their own, but they would get to about halfway through their research and decision-making process, halfway through their buyer's journey, and then they'd be open to having a meeting with a vendor, talking with someone from your sales team. At the time, CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, did research with Salesforce and SiriusDecisions, and they found that about 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before vendor contact, before sales contact. That wasn't too bad, right? Because if you did everything right, the game was 56% over, but your account executives, your account managers, your business development, they were in there for the last 44% of the journey. So you still had a lot of chance to educate and build trust, a lot of surface area. Unfortunately, those days are now very much in the rearview mirror. It's a nostalgic memory of, wow, we thought it was so complicated, but by comparison now it was so simple. That 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%, and it shows no sign of slowing down anytime soon. What that means is 83% of researching, decision-making, and comparing pricing now happens before you are in the room. They're doing so much research on their own before they ever get to you. They're almost ready to buy before they're finally ready for a meeting with an account executive, sales development rep, someone in that kind of capacity. So you're only, best case scenario, you're only in there for the final 17%. So this changes the nature of what we need to be thinking about with our marketing and sales strategy for a high-speed internet and connectivity provider, and basically anyone in and around telecommunications. So we need to get really clear about who it is that are our ideal clients that we want to be building relationships with, that we need to educate and build trust with. And the way we'll typically get a handle on that is we'll look at historically where our company has done best. Maybe there's clues about this sitting in the logos on your website, or in the case studies section of your website, or in your reviews, or for sure, when you look in your CRM, you should be able to, your customer relationship management system, you should be able to get an idea as to which clients spend the most, which are the most profitable, which have the smoothest sales cycle, which have the highest net promoter score, all the early warning signs or early leading indicators that you're on the right track with scaling and accelerating your product market fit and go-to-market fit. So in order to know who we're building this marketing and sales strategy with, we need to get really specific about who they are at the company level. So that's your ideal client profile, knowing geographically where they're located. That's got a lot of relevance to telecommunications companies, high-speed internet and connectivity providers, because we know either you have fiber, or either you have the ability to deliver in that area, or you don't. So are you selling primarily to people in that surrounding area that are looking for connectivity to their particular location, whether it's a tower, whether it's fiber, whether it's data, whatever it is? Or are they way outside your geographic area and they need some connectivity that's in your location? But either way, the geographic coverage for sure plays an enormous role in being able to sell connectivity. Second, when you look at your ideal client profile, how big or how small do your best clients tend to be? Do you do really well with Fortune 500 companies, or do you struggle to advance sales opportunities and retain those kinds of clients, but you're phenomenal at large, small businesses and mid-market, like, companies that may have anywhere from 50 to 5,000 employees or 50 to 1,000 employees or something like that. So get really specific about not only where they're located, but how big or how small they are. And third, are there certain industries that you've done especially well within? And are there certain industries that you've really struggled within? That's really important as well to document in that ideal client profile. Like maybe, for example, you've done really well in healthcare and manufacturing and financial services, but maybe you've struggled a lot in education and government. It's important to have that down and documented because that will have a lot of downflow impact on what you do with your marketing and sales strategy and go-to-market strategy in general. In other words, like as you build out target account lists, as you do your website copywriting, as you decide what goes on your homepage, what parts of your website each need separate pages and separate lead magnets, separate lead generation funnels, separate educational event strategy, separate social channels, a whole host of issues. And in many cases within the data center ecosystem, we're seeing the emergence of marketing and sales teams specializing in certain kinds of segments, either specializing by account size, like SMB, small and medium-sized business versus mid-market versus enterprise. Some are specializing by industry. They're hiring account executives and marketing talent that bring deep expertise in certain vertical markets. Going back decades, there's almost always been a split between direct sales and indirect sales, like channel partner type sales. And we're increasingly seeing, as companies' channel partner footprint and strategy becomes more sophisticated, that it's very, very common to find companies in and around telecommunications having, growing, and supporting multiple different kinds of channel partner programs. At the minimum, two, in many cases, you'll see three or more, because they recognize that MSPs are different than master agents, and master agents are different than consultants. And it's up to you to figure out like where you're going to win the best. But we increasingly see, not only is there stronger segmentation and personalization with your direct go-to-market strategy, we're seeing stronger levels of segmentation and personalization even within channel partner ecosystems among channel chiefs and the organizations that they build. So at a high level, we know the business model, we know the accounts, we need to know the individual roles as well. Who are the people in these accounts that are really critical for you to build deep relationships with? And in many cases, it's going to vary depending on their business model and their size. Because depending on how big or how small their company is, there's different job roles that have an influential role in deciding what kind of telecommunications, connectivity kind of partnerships they have and who will handle those. At a very large data center operator or a very large enterprise company, where there's potentially hundreds, if not thousands of people that work in that IT organization, that is a very, very different process than having a relationship with a independently owned co-location operator with one or two or three different locations, where the company may be all of 50 or 75 employees. There's maybe 10 or 15 people that work in IT. And because of that, everyone knows everyone else. Everyone may not be reporting to the CTO, but they certainly, in an IT organization with 10, 20, 30 employees, they for sure have strong familiarity with who sits in each one of these roles and where to send this kind of information, these kinds of offers. But at the end of the day, we need to get clarity at the company level, at the individual level, that your buyer personas, and prioritize based on who's going to have the most economic impact on what they decide to do with high-speed internet and connectivity relationships and partnerships. And typically you'll rank those, prioritize those. So you have a primary, a secondary, maybe a tertiary buyer persona. And within those, we need to know their goals and their challenges that they're working on individually, as a team, and as a company. When we're able to dial in who's most important to build this relationship with, who's second most important to build this relationship with, maybe who's third most important, and we understand what's going on in their world, in their own words, their biggest professional goals, their biggest professional struggles, we can use that information, again, in their own words, to craft an amazingly impactful marketing, sales, go-to-market playbook, using their words to pull them in by the virtual shirt collar, to show them extreme relevance, that we have content, that we have educational resources, that we have educational events that speak to exactly what they're trying to accomplish, that speak to exactly what they're struggling with most. And this needs to be actual research, not guessing. Sure, you can talk to some people internally that work with these accounts and have a lot of experience with these accounts, but I don't want you to get this research secondhand information. It's like, there's a bizarre irony. There's a kids game that people have played for years called the telephone game. I don't know if it's still popular with kids, but I know as a Gen Xer, when I was growing up, it's like you sit around in a circle and you whisper in the kid's ear that's next to you. And by the time it gets all the way around the circle and it's passed through 10, 20, 30 kids, you're trying to see how the message has actually changed. So we don't want there to be a loss of fidelity. We don't want there to be a loss of getting their goals and challenges, getting that insight in their own words. So we need to either have face-to-face interviews, video interviews, phone interviews. We could do surveys with qualitative and quantitative questions. We could study a stack of their LinkedIn profiles and what comes up on search and social footprint. How do they describe themselves? What kinds of content do they share? What kind of events do they attend? What kind of certifications they have? What kind of skills are they endorsed for? And when we have the consensus on that, it becomes much easier to build extreme empathy around the marketing and the sales strategies that we need to attract and engage and educate and build trust with the most important people in those segments. And even more important than that, not just attract and engage, but turn the corner with a modern go-to-market playbook so that we don't appear as a telecommunications vendor anymore, but instead our client-facing team members show up as the be-all, end-all experts on anything and everything that's directly and indirectly related to the goals and challenges that they are struggling with. Like a perfect example when you're doing this kind of buyer persona research is maybe cybersecurity shows up as one of their biggest challenges or one of their biggest goals, and be like, well, we're a telecommunications company. We don't specialize in cybersecurity. Yeah, but one of the 5 biggest things they're worried about is cybersecurity. So what do you do with that? Well, do you have a chief information security officer within your company? Do you have someone who actually is a subject matter expert within your company? Do you have channel partners that are cybersecurity experts? Well, you need to bring those folks together and work on educational resources, educational events for this segment that allow your ideal clients, your ideal prospects, maybe your ideal channel partners, to learn and grow together with your internal and external subject matter experts on topics that are directly and indirectly related to what you do. From a tactical perspective, this usually looks a lot like having a fantastic webinar series, having a fantastic lunch and learn breakfast seminar type of series. The idea is, let's say, for example, in doing this customer insight research, you discover 10 or 12 goals or challenges that this particular segment is struggling with. Great. Figure out which is the most frequent, which is the second most frequent, rank that in that order, and you have just discovered the 10 or 12 webinars, the 10 or 12 breakfast seminars that you need to do once a month for the next 10 or 12 months. And when you discover that buyer persona number 2, who in the case of telecommunications, maybe is an infrastructure person, maybe it's an engineer, maybe it's a finance person, or maybe it's an owner, maybe it's a channel partner, whatever it is. And when you discover that that segment has 10 or 12 of their own goals and challenges, guess what? That's another series, another once a month webinar, once a month in-person event series that, again, starting with the most popular, working your way down to the least popular, and use their exact words. This isn't rocket science. We're not trying to guess. We're not trying to be smart or clever. We're just taking basically the consensus on what we know they're trying to figure out and what they're struggling with the most, And we're going to look a lot more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, and perhaps most of all, trusted advisors. Because when we share helpful information that helps them and their team do their job better, the trust externality, the trust impact is quite remarkable. And when you do this well, what tends to happen is person number one that registers gets back an email from you that says, gee, when it comes to cybersecurity among your fiber lines in a meet room or whatever it is that are going to the panel, that are going to the rack, it typically takes a village. There's people involved from operations, from engineering, hardware, whatever it is. Like you list out the 4 or 5 different titles that are in there. So with that in mind, who else from your team would also benefit from attending this webinar, would benefit from attending this breakfast seminar, would benefit from attending this lunch and learn? Simply hit the forward button, let them know why, and you'd be shocked at how this very simple email marketing automation that frankly you've been able to do for 20 years now. One is how few companies actually follow through and do a good job executing on this. And second, how incredibly impactful it is when you start to do these webinars, when you start to do these educational events and you see 2, 3, 4 people from the same company attending together. Because teams that learn together grow together. You're driving alignment and you're collectively educating and building trust with multiple stakeholders from that same company. That's how you're spreading your impact, spreading your brand and your knowledge throughout that decision committee. And remember, like in a self-driven buyer's journey, it's very common to find that there's dozens of touch points, 25, 30 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decisions. So you're not done the first time you do this. It's why, like I said, if you discover 10 or 12 goals or challenges once a month, every month like clockwork for the next 12 months. And over time, when this is working well, maybe the first month out, there's out of 20 people that are attending, 40 people that are attending, you notice a couple of clusters of 2 people from the same company. When you repeat that the next month, the next quarter, the goal is for those people that attended to have gotten so much value that when you prompt them again for who else, like, oh, wow, the second time there was 2 people from this company that came last time. Now there's 6 people from the same company that came last time. That's 6 out of a 20-person IT department. Holy smokes, we are really making some inroads in this company. And that's where a lot of times post-event, they'll come up to you and say, oh, we do these all hands. We do these offsite retreats. Do you want to come in and present at our company, in our training site, in our conference room to our entire IT department? Whoa, that's amazing. And obviously, if there's 20 people in the entire IT department, that's a large small business, a mid-market kind of company. It's not quite enterprise, but it's the same basic idea, is that we're using educational events and educational resources to drive alignment, significant alignment, education and trust building in the early and the middle stages of the journey. So when they're finally ready for a sales-related conversation, the know, like, and trust is already off the charts. You're for sure on the short list. In many cases, if your events have been so helpful, you're actually knocking a lot of your competitors off of the short list too. Sometimes the short list ends up becoming a short list of one option, your company. So that's how I would approach that playbook for how a high-speed internet and connectivity provider can address changing marketing and sales strategy. So what do we got up next? What's question number 2 for this week? So this one's on the facilities side of the data center ecosystem. The question is, how does a data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure firm align its content and value for its ideal clients' needs? How does a data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure firm align its content and its value for its ideal clients' needs? So let's think about where our company is within the data center ecosystem. So we're not an operator. We're not a technology company. We're a facilities related company. Power, cooling, commissioning, decommissioning, physical security. We're spending a lot of time with facilities managers, the people that run the buildings. This is not quite construction, although in the early stages of planning a brand new data center, construction developers, real estate investors for sure are involved. Facilities on an ongoing basis is typically handled by facilities managers, building engineers, HVAC, electricians, MEP. And a lot of this gets decided at the time of construction. A lot of this gets decided at the time of design and as commissioning. So there is something to be said for getting into that ecosystem as well. A company that provides data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure wouldn't have that much to do with an outsourced sales and marketing company unless they're using that as a substitute or as a supplement to building that kind of capacity internally. But yeah, data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure solidly entrenched within the data center facilities part of the data center digital infrastructure and critical facilities ecosystem. So how does it align its content and value for its ideal client needs? So we need to understand who these ideal clients are. In most cases, companies that provide energy, cooling, and infrastructure at a high level have two different categories of buyers. There's the buyers who are making decisions on retrofits, upgrades, ongoing maintenance and expansion. Those kinds of buyers would typically be at data center operators or end users that own their own data centers. So like colocation providers, hyperscale providers, edge providers, as well as enterprises that own their own data centers. So that's category one. And that's, again, mostly having to do with upgrades, expansions of existing facilities, maintenance. And then the second broad category is pre-construction. This is getting in front of developers, contractors, designers, site selection to a certain degree. Usually it would be handled at that stage by designers and planners and GCs and construction companies, at least somewhat related to mechanical, electrical, kind of plumbing kind of contractors as well in that part of the facility. So it's super important to understand with your business model where you've historically done best. And that should be reflected in your ideal client profile. For sure, when it comes to energy, cooling, and infrastructure, there's very, very much a geographic part of this. These kinds of services could be delivered virtually on video conference, but in most cases, it involves physical site visits. So there's a geographic part of this. It's not like delivering cloud services where the location isn't quite as important. In the case of energy, cooling, and infrastructure, yeah, having coverage, having physical presence in that area usually becomes incredibly important. Company size, where do you do best? Can you really sell energy, cooling, and infrastructure to huge Fortune 500 kinds of companies with hundreds of thousands of employees and potentially hundreds of people or thousands of people that work in engineering and facilities related roles across hundreds of different data center facilities? Or do you thrive with smaller companies where there's maybe 10 or 20 people that work in facilities across the entire company? Like they have 3, 4, 5 data center facilities across a handful of locations. So ultimately, or somewhere in the middle, ultimately you'll need to answer that question on what kinds of clients that you've done best. But for a company that provides energy, cooling, and infrastructure, knowing where you have coverage, knowing how big or small those companies are, and are there certain verticals, are there certain segments where you've done better than others that are a better fit than others? And then within those accounts, who are the people that matter most? Typically in large enterprise accounts, you'll have different kinds of much more granular stakeholders that are a lot more specialized, whereas in smaller accounts, smaller companies, you'll have fewer stakeholders that wear lots of different hats, that take on lots of different roles. So again, depending on how big or small your company is, and depending on how big or small your clients are, that will impact the goals and challenges that they're working on, how they articulate those, and how you potentially approach your segmentation strategy and what you do with content, what you do with events, and really understanding your ideal client's needs. In some cases too, beyond just the facilities professionals in data center operators and end users, beyond companies that are involved in very early stages in the life cycle of a data center, like construction, developers, commissioning folks, designers. Beyond that, and in some cases too, there's companies that do reasonably well with what you'd consider channel partners. These are consultancies, integrators that provide a lot of recommendations, but they don't work internally in any of these companies. So in a lot of cases, they used to work in similar kinds of roles in these companies and they went out on their own and then they provide something a little different. There's companies too that provide technology that's directly related to this. Like I've had a couple people on the Data Center Go to Market podcast that provide like IoT, Internet of Things sensors and related software that help instrument what's going on inside of data center facilities to provide analytics to help companies better manage and understand issues around energy and cooling and infrastructure. So in terms of providing that content and value for your clients' needs, as long as you're pretty well established and you've gotten way past the point where you have product market fit, you know exactly what they're buying from you, the price points, how often they buy, all the basic questions around unit economics, then backing into content and value really largely comes down to understanding at the company level who buys, and within these companies who's most important. And then within the companies who's most important, your most important stakeholder that shows up on a decision committee is your primary buyer persona. The second most important kind of stakeholder would be your secondary buyer persona. In some cases, in larger accounts, there could be a third or fourth most important buyer persona. And then for each of those, starting with our highest priority, our primary, we need to understand what's going on in their world. We need to have extreme empathy for what they're working on professionally, what their goals are, what shows up in job descriptions, what shows up in OKRs and objectives and key results, for what they need to accomplish and what their team needs to accomplish and what their company needs to accomplish at the intersection of data center, energy, cooling, and infrastructure. And then the flip side of that, not only what they're trying to accomplish, but what's driving them nuts, their biggest challenges, their biggest stressors. And we need these insights in their own words, not what you think their words are, but what their words actually are. And it doesn't mean that 100% of their goals and 100% of their challenges are going to line up to things that you can monetize. It's very possible that energy, cooling, and infrastructure is like a third or a half or 2/3 of their job. And there may be quite a few other topics, quite a few other goals, quite a few other challenges that are located adjacent to what you do, but are still very much front burner for your primary and your secondary stakeholders, the primary and secondary buyer personas that show up on these decision committees. So again, in order to provide helpful educational content, helpful educational events, provide value around their needs, we need to understand what those needs actually are, walk a mile, walk a kilometer in their shoes, and have extreme empathy for what they're working on. And the biggest value we can do in many cases is by introducing people in those segments to how others in similar kinds of job roles and similar kinds of companies have dealt with attaining those goals, have dealt with addressing those particular challenges. And the more hyper specific those insights are to who they are, where they work, and what they care about, the more likely it is that you will be very, very welcomed in. Like imagine someone scrolling through LinkedIn or YouTube or search results or something like that, or their chatbot results, and imagine being able to pull them in by the virtual shirt collar because the headline, the promise, the value of what you're providing is hyper specific to who they are and what they care about. It should almost have this reaction of like, how the heck did they know? Well, you knew because you did your homework. You looked at 10, 20, 30 people that are just like them. You study the heck out of what's going on in their world. What's top of mind for someone that's a leading indicator that they're going to need help with data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure in a couple of weeks, potentially in a couple of months, that allows you to get in early and get in often by the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so they don't just see you as a vendor who provides professional services to data center facilities, but they see you and your client-facing team members as world-class, the be-all, end-all experts on anything and everything having to do with data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure for this particular job role in a particular geographic region for a certain size company in certain kinds of industries. And the more value, the more extreme specificity that you're able to provide that around, the more it's like, wow, it stops them in their tracks and gets them to pay attention. But it's like nearly impossible to ignore because you've eliminated a ton of competitive noise out there that's providing generic information. Now, companies that understand this education trust building framework and getting in early and getting in often, what's important to keep in mind is the nature of your competition changes. Because 10 years ago, if we were having this conversation around someone that provides energy, cooling, and infrastructure, you'd largely be concerned with other companies that provide very similar kinds of services, like your direct competitors. If you were really thinking a little bit further ahead, you might consider indirect competitors. Those would typically be companies that are a lot bigger or a lot smaller than yours, or not quite as geographically relevant. What most people don't think about at all is, in addition to direct competition and indirect competition, there's what I've been calling for the better part of a decade now, non-business model competition. What's non-business model competition? They're not in the data center energy business or the data center cooling business or the data center infrastructure business, but they're really, really good at publishing and promoting fantastic educational content and hosting fantastic educational events on the topics that are top of mind for your most important buyer personas. So they, in a lot of ways, are creating competition for your ideal client's attention. That all needs to be factored into play when we decide if you're just going to dip your pinky toe into this whole content, educational events, resources playbook that has been very, very influential among data center operators and technology and facilities companies for the better part of a year. Or are you recognizing that this is where all the attention is going? There have been generational changes that have happened in the past couple of years and has only accelerated recently. Typically when I talk to people that are lagging in this kind of strategy, they rationalize that their clients are different. Like, how are they different? Really seriously, how are they different? And how frequently, how are you doing this customer insight research? When was the last time you refreshed this? Because at the risk of oversimplifying it, I'm on the young end of the range of Gen X. All of the baby boomers that I know that are still working full-time or part-time advisory kinds of roles in and around the data center ecosystem, nearly 100% of them have fully adopted this kind of platform in recent years, the ones that are still actively working. They're all on LinkedIn. They're on LinkedIn several times a day. They communicate with their colleagues, with their clients, with the companies that they work as advisors with through LinkedIn as like their second CRM. They attend webinars. In many cases, they're at the stage of their career where they're frequently speaking at and sought after guest experts to speak at webinars in the same way they speak at conferences, again, at the stage of their career. They're on podcasts, frequently sought after guests. So they totally get all of this digital self-service playbook. So I'd ask you, if you think that your clients, that you think that your channel partners for some reason are this bizarre outlier who never uses search engines, who never uses Copilot or ChatGPT to do research, that would never in a million years watch a YouTube video or attend a webinar or listen to podcasts, like, do your homework. Figure out if this is a limiting belief that's causing your company to operate like it has its hands tied behind its back, like it's waiting for a resurgence of printed phone books or printed trade publications, like you think the fax machine and the BlackBerry are coming back sometime soon. Hey, you got a fax modem ready to go? Like, most of the buyer personas that are incredibly relevant for a company that is principally in the business of data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure are working on various forms of transformation initiatives within their companies. Nearly all internal champions that are working on transformation initiatives are among the 1 billion plus people that are on LinkedIn. You could make a pretty strong argument that if you can't find a particular person on LinkedIn, they are probably not your internal champion, or they may have not given you truthful information about who they are, and they're playing bizarre, hey, let's play whack-a-mole kinds of sales games. But in nearly all cases, the people that are leading these kinds of initiatives internally at data center operators, end user data centers, construction companies, data center developers, investors, data center real estate investment trusts. In that ecosystem, they're all very, very actively involved in consuming, publishing content, in many cases, helping to promote and amplify this kinds of content. And the sooner you adapt to that, the easier it is to create content that aligns with how they're looking to learn, how their peers are looking to learn, how ecosystems come together and get aligned on core values. And this is the number one strategy that I would recommend if you're serious about, as a data center, energy, cooling, and infrastructure firm, aligning content and value to your ideal client's needs, is figure out exactly what these needs are, get it in their own words, and then create a competitive presence in your digital, heavily focused playbook around educational events, around educational resources, and make sure that you are available when they want to engage. Not when you want to engage, but when they want to engage, which in many cases is going to be 2:00 on a Sunday afternoon on a holiday weekend, when most of your commercial team isn't going to be around for another 36 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, or in the middle of the night because their cooling system crashed for the final time and ruined their vacation and they had to call back, and now their family's feeling pissed that they got their vacation cut short. So like, the research process kicks off and accelerates at really bizarre times. If you do business across time zones, you're probably a little more used to this, but even if you're just hyper local, it accelerates based on their needs, not your needs. And the better job you can do at understanding what those needs are and what the trigger events are for them kicking off this research process, accelerating this research process that ultimately is going to lead to them making a significant investment in data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure kind of services, the better off you're going to be. So that's how I would address how a data center energy, cooling, and infrastructure firm can align its content and its value for its clients' needs. What do we got up next? This is a really interesting question that we actually don't get that often, because it's in the fifth part of what we consider the fifth part of the data center ecosystem. How does a data center conference and events company attract the right clients? How does a data center conference events company attract the right clients? So let's review where a data center events conference company sits within the data center ecosystem. It's not a data center operator. They're not a hyperscale or a colo or an edge provider or a modular data center provider or something like that. They're not a data center technology or a data center facilities company. They're not involved with construction or real estate or investment. A data center conference events company lives within the outsourced marketing segment of the data center industry, of the data center digital infrastructure critical facilities ecosystem. Also within that fifth segment of outsourced sales and marketing, in addition to data center conference and events companies, they sit side by side with sales brokers, sales agencies, sales enablement companies, marketing agencies, PR agencies, recruiters. A lot of people don't normally think of talent and staffing and recruiting in outsourced sales and marketing, but we for sure do. And actually quite a few forward-thinking data center recruitment firms are very heavily involved now in content and events kinds of initiatives. And they recognize that they basically are in the business of marketing and selling career opportunities on behalf of aligning candidates with hiring managers. Another kind of company that we often consider an extension of outsourced sales and marketing is training. Sometimes the training is very closely aligned with technology and facilities, and you can consider an extension of that, meaning like it's sponsored by a facilities related company, it's sponsored by a technology related company. So this would be like training and certifications from like Microsoft or AWS or Cisco or something like that on the technology side, or Lumen on the technology side. On the facilities side, it may be training and certification from companies like Vertiv or Schneider or Legrand or Eaton or something like that. But independent third-party companies that provide vendor-neutral kind of training that's designed to build up the ecosystem, we consider them part of outsourced sales and marketing. brokerages, manufacturers, reps, not real estate brokerages, they're in the construction and real estate segment, but companies that basically are providing marketing and sales support on a commission-only basis. Again, all part of outsourced sales and marketing. Okay, so now that we've oriented ourselves to where a data center conference events company lives, how do they attract the right clients? That's a fantastic question. And we now live in a world where conference companies, events companies are having a moment because of the massive growth that's happening in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities right now. There is insane amounts of capital flowing into these kinds of businesses. As a result, a lot of that capital is flowing into investing in what we consider paid conference opportunities. In some cases, they're earned conference opportunities, but in many cases, it's simply paid. So historically, marketing professionals, go-to-market professionals, sales professionals, and channel professionals, product professionals have talked about the idea of paid media versus earned media versus owned media, especially within marketing and media and communications. So like paid media historically has meant buying advertising, buying sponsorships, which when we take that over from media into the conference world, means you're buying something from a data center events and conference company, which typically is either a sponsorship or a booth or one in the both or a paid speaking slot, basically paying to speak. That's what would be considered paid events, paid media. Then there's earned. Earned media historically has meant that either through your own brand building, your own internal public relations, working with an external public relations firms, that you've earned mentions in other people's media. So like the traditional playbook for this was you have something really special, you hire a PR agency, and their goal is to get you or your client, you or their clients quoted in all kinds of relevant big name publications. Like in the data center industry, publications that people would probably chase a lot after would be like Data Center Knowledge, Tech Capital, Data Center Dynamics. For general business media, it might be getting their client quoted in like the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, CNBC, BBC, a host of business and financial kinds of publications that are especially relevant with both quotes and interviews and things like that. That's earned media. And the way that typically comes together in data center conference and events is this is earning the ability to speak purely on editorial merits, meaning that your company is not spending money to buy a speaking slot, meaning that you went through a competitive process of submitting a title and an abstract of what you wanted to talk about at that event, as well as a bio and some speaking credentials of where you've spoken out in the past, an advisory council that's typically not employees of the events and conference producer, but more closely resembles the demographics of who typically attends. That advisory council, that advisory committee vets the stack of digital applications for a conference, typically at least 6 to 9 months before that particular event. And they're like, okay, they went through a stack of, for argument's sake, let's say they got 500 applications for 50 speaking slots. So they pick the 10% that they think is best purely on editorial merits, purely based on providing a ton of value to the anticipated attendees at this upcoming event. And those are the 50 people that earn these editorial speaking slots. So this is earned media, earned events exposure. So there's paid and earned. There's also owned media, owned events, OWN. What is owned media? What are owned events? Owned media historically is media that your company can control. So this would be blogs. This would be having an email newsletter. This would be in the pre-digital days. Perhaps you're sending out a company published magazine or print newsletter or something like that. It's basically media where you own the editorial, you own the distribution, you own everything. It's 100% within your control. Now, there is a version of that, not just for media, there's actually a version of that for events. And I think it's one of the most underutilized opportunities, undervalued, underappreciated opportunities in the entire data center ecosystem right now, is the idea of going all in on hosting your own educational events for your most important buyer personas. And there's two different ways to do this at a high level. There's virtual events, webinars, and similar kinds of virtual events. This isn't anything that's particularly new. I've been planning and hosting webinars since 2008. And for 5 or 6 years before that technology existed, they've run on teleconference bridge lines. But as voice over IP and all those SaaS and cloud technologies come into place, so it's not especially new. If it's new to your company, you're arriving late to the party. I'd encourage you to catch up and close that gap if you want to be competitive. So there's virtual events, digital events, and then there's offline events. And again, these are very specific to your ideal client profile. They're very specific to the personas that you want to be building relationships with. And just like webinars, the cool part is because they're so much lower cost, because they're so much more specific, you really don't need large numbers of attendees to really, really move the needle. I talk with people from data center operators, like co-location companies, all the time. Like if you have a conference room, if you have a classroom in one of your facilities that can comfortably sit 10, 15, 20 people, great. I'd encourage you to figure out a way for, it's probably not 52 weeks of the year, maybe it's 45 or 48 weeks of the year, figure out a way so once a week that room is reserved for a 2-hour, 3-hour half day kind of event for each of your 3 or 4 most important segments, or each of your 3 or 4 sales teams that's responsible for growing pipeline in that particular area. Like, so for example, if you have a primary and a secondary and a tertiary buyer persona, you have 3 different segments. Good. Week 1, each month is for primary. Week 2, each month is for your secondary buyer persona. Week 3 is for your tertiary buyer persona, meaning every 4 weeks, use that classroom, use that conference room to host an amazing educational event that is hyper specific in value for your primary, for your secondary, for your tertiary buyer personas. As long as you already have your ideal client profile defined, as long as you already have your target account list defined, as long as you have your buyer personas defined, it doesn't matter whether you're hosting this virtually, digitally for people that can't easily drive to your facility, or whether you're hosting this in person or you're doing both of these. At the end of the day, what's most important is understanding what's going on in their world, extreme empathy for your most important buyer personas, and delivering strong educational value that's more closely aligned with professional development and learning development than what they would see at a booth at an expo. That learning and development can be supplemented, especially when it's in person, with a little bit of professional networking for 20, 30 minutes before the event starts and putting out some nice breakfast or lunch or something. The headline is typically 1 or 2 speakers that provide extreme subject matter expertise on a topic that's very important to them and near and dear to them. They talk for 30 or 45 minutes, hopefully interactive and fun and entertaining and useful. They have a Q&A session, 10, 15, 20 minutes. You have an hour for the formal session, take everyone for a tour around the data center facility afterwards, and have a little bit of mingling and networking afterwards, and just lather, rinse, and repeat that 2, 3, 4 times a month with your 2 or 3 4 most important segments. Maybe you collaborate with some channel partners, maybe you host an event to recruit. There's a lot of different ways you can do this, but at the end of the day, most companies don't realize how impactful it can be, even with very small numbers and a very modest budget, to having incredible impact on your pipeline with your own events. So when we put it in those terms, you relatively quickly realize that internal marketing, internal sales is kind of sort of in competition with media and events and conferences companies. And there's certainly a place for both. Typically, the conference and events companies are going much wider than you're going, with much larger numbers. And because of that, people are really excited about vanity metrics. We have hundreds of attendees. We have thousands of attendees. But when you really dig into how close a match their demographics were last year and how close a match their anticipated demographics are this year, matching up with your ideal client profile and your buyer personas, a lot of times there's a pretty big loss factor. So do you want quantity or do you want quality? For most people, if you have the ability to do both, it can work. I'd encourage you to mostly focus on the events where there's a really, really tight match between their demographics and your ideal client profile, your target buyer personas. But just recognize that like when you're one of 50 speakers and there's 5 tracks, there may be 2,500 people or 5,000 people at that conference, but how many of them are really paying non-divided attention to your speaker for 45, 50 minutes? 100, 200, a couple dozen, something like that. And it's the same thing with your booth. Yeah, it's cool for the conference events company that they got hundreds of exhibitors. It's great for their business model and everything. But the reality is, if in 16 hours that exhibit hall is open, if most of the people are only visiting for 4 or 8 of those hours when there happens to be a cocktail hour going on at the same time, okay, so they're there for 240 minutes, maybe they're there for 480 minutes, and half of that time is spent socializing with their peers. The other time is spent walking around to booths, and divide 240 minutes divided by 400 booths, and you figure out how many minutes you're going to get. Is it even one? It sounds like 2/3 of a minute for each booth. So it's not a lot of time to be able to build rapport and educate and build trust. So in a lot of ways, this should be looked at as a top of funnel. So we're talking here about a lot of the pros and cons of investing aggressively in data center events and conferences versus building your own funnel or supplementing the two together. But at the end of the day, for the data center conference and events company attracting the right clients, they basically have a couple of different categories of stakeholders that they need to attract. And it's gotten to the point where the segmentation and the targeting is so complicated that many times they're incentivizing the demand based on categories that are underrepresented where they need more people there. Like, for example, one of the biggest global events companies, conference companies in the space has tiered, actually it's not one, there's multiple that I can think of that has tiered registration pricing depending on which category you fit into and how much they want that category represented at their particular event. Like, for example, if you work as a data center manager for an end user, in some cases, it's totally free for you to attend. If you work as a IT or facilities executive for a data center operator, it's not free, but it's heavily discounted. If you work for a channel partner, if you work for any kind of consultant or integrator, you pay full price. And in some cases, they even want to make it so the you pay full price category gets awfully close to the entry level price point of buying a booth, of exhibiting at that particular event. Because at the end of the day, they really don't want just one person from your company to attend. They know if you get a booth, there's going to be a minimum of 2, usually at least 3 or 4 people from that company that are needed to staff the booth. So there's more people to the conference, more revenue to the conference. So that's one part of the funnel. So they're trying to attract people in different segments. In this particular model, which I know of at least 2 global data center conference events companies that utilize this, where end users in some cases are free or very heavily subsidized by everyone else. People that work in technology and facilities roles within data center operators are discounted, but people on the commercial side of those companies are in the third category. They're considered the same as like vendors and integrators, channel partners, resellers, managed service providers. And all of those folks, really what they're really trying to do is to get you to come to the conclusion that if there's 2, 3, 4 people from your company, they're all attending together, you may as well get a booth. And we know there's a lot of budgeting and planning that's way beyond the cost of the booth that determines what your investment is in that particular event. But those are the kinds of segments that they are typically trying to attract. So just like you, when it comes to your go-to-market, the publishers, the CEOs, the leadership of these companies need to really, really understand their targeting and their segmentation strategy for who's the ideal company that fits in each of these segments and who's the ideal kind of stakeholder. Because even as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, that when it comes to like people that work for a co-location or a hyperscale company or an edge provider, there's a big difference between how they look at the technology and the IT and the facilities professionals in those companies compared to the sales executives, compared to the account managers, compared to the channel managers, compared to the marketers from those companies. So it's a very, very granular approach to their demand generation. In many cases, there's requirements to be able to attend. In some cases, there's applications to be able to attend. In a lot of cases, there's now financial incentives given to preferred categories of prospects and clients that they want to be able to attract to that kind of event. And that's just on the commercial, on the revenue side. Then on the editorial side, there's also a lot of thought given to who the speakers are going to be, who the speakers are going to be that are going to be doing keynotes. Is there budget for a paid keynote, or are most people getting compensated by getting free registration to that particular event? Who's going to moderate panels? Who are the panelists? Are they going to sell a certain amount of paid sessions that are either delivered in the conference setting or delivered on the expo floor? There's a lot of different decisions that come into play with deciding how a data center conference events company attracts the right clients. But make no mistake, in the world we live in now, this is a really, really big business. There's companies like 8-figure, 9-figure, publicly traded kind of companies that are going all in on this. It takes a lot of capital to be able to run these massive events with thousands of attendees and these large conference and event centers. There still is for sure a place for one-day events that are done locally where the budget is considerably lower. Typically for one-day events that are done locally, they know probably 80% of the people that are attending are able to sleep in their own beds that night, meaning that it's a 30 or 60-minute drive to where the conference is located. Sure, there'll always be some people that are traveling in for a one-day event. Typically, the shorter the event is, the more likely it is that nearly all of the attendees, nearly all of the speakers are coming from that immediate area. And then when you get down to like half-day events or 2-hour events or something like that, you won't get people that are traveling even 60 minutes. You're getting people that are typically only going to travel under an hour or under 30 minutes, the shorter the event tends to be. So these are all the things to be thinking about for a data center conference events company that wants to attract the right clients. And I think these are also really important considerations for those that invest in these kinds of conferences, which can be a really good top of the funnel, middle of the funnel investment if it lines up really, really well with your ideal client profile and their projected in last year's kind of demographics. But we see a lot of people also chasing after these kinds of events without doing that most basic of basic due diligence on do their demographics match up with your target demographics. And the second part of it is realistically, how much education and trust building can you do in that kind of setting, in that kind of environment? Because when it comes to hosting your own events, your owned webinars, your owned breakfast seminars, your owned lunch and learn series, like 80-90% of the time is education and trust building. It's not about saying, oh, wow, that was a really fun party. We had a blast at the golf tournament, cool booth. Like the cool and the fun, does it really move the needle on the transformation that you need as a company to get multiple stakeholders from that company on board to what you're trying to do? So at the end of the day, there's a lot of different views on which parts of this have value, which parts of this have less value. It's ultimately up to you to figure out which works best for your business model. But at the end of the day, these are some things that you should be thinking about if you're investing in data center conferences and events as a lead generator, as a good part of your go-to-market strategy. And these are also typically what goes on behind the scenes with data center conference and events companies that are for-profit entities that need to build a scalable, profitable business just like yours. So that was the third question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live show. We're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And when we come back, we'll tackle 3 more big sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you are watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week we tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. If you've been getting good value so far, if you've been learning a lot of valuable tips and best practices so far from this week's show, make sure that you help spread the word, help share the love by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on. And if you have an idea for a topic, a question, a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, make sure to share that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching, and we will add that to the consideration queue for topics to address in upcoming shows. So what's up next? The next topic that we're going to be talking about today for this week is for data center infrastructure. So the question is, how does a data center infrastructure support and optimization company improve its name recognition? How does a company that's principally in the business of data center infrastructure support and optimization improve its name recognition? That's a fantastic question. A lot of this comes down to how you position your business model and where you've done best in the past and where historically and where you anticipate that your company wants to go next, and the kinds of clients that it wants to attract and retain in the coming months and in the coming years. So data center infrastructure, data center support, data center optimization usually leans a little bit more heavily towards data center technology, but data center infrastructure, a lot of times, even optimization to a certain degree, can be heavily involved on the facility side as well, because the technology and the facilities, especially when it comes to the impact of bringing AI and GPUs and high performance computing and supercomputing into data centers, they really are tightly joined at the hips. So as you're building your team, as you're building out your business model, it's increasingly common to find that you need multidisciplinary experts like engineers and facilities experts working side by side with technologists from all different parts of the IT industry, from all different parts of facilities and engineering as well. So to improve your name recognition, what I'd encourage you to do is to think beyond your current website content. What do I mean by that? Let's go back to the basics. Let's make sure that we're really clear on the kinds of companies that have been a great fit for working with your company in the past, where they have strong needs for infrastructure support and optimization on an ongoing basis. And what do they have in common? What have you learned about working with these kinds of companies over the years? And these more than likely are the same kind of companies that you plaster their logos on your website. You publish and promote great case studies. There's reviews, testimonials. There's certainly evidence of all this sitting in your CRM and your customer relationship management system with which clients are driving the most revenue, which are the most profitable, which have the least amount of headaches, which are the happiest, the highest net promoter scores, which are most likely to expand and grow with your company over time. All of those, depending on your leadership priorities, are healthy indicators that, one, you have product market fit, probably have go-to-market fit as well, and gives you an idea of what kinds of clients you want next. So when it comes to name recognition and brand name recognition, it's super important to think about where we are, not just in the data center industry, but where your buyers are in terms of their evolution. Because 10 years ago, in the fairly early days of search and social and cloud and mobile, most of the buyers for things like infrastructure support and optimization did quite a bit of research on their own. And they got about halfway through the research and decision-making process. And then they said, okay, now I'm ready to talk to a person. I'll book a consultation. I'll book a needs assessment. I'll fill out essentially what's a talk to sales form. And I'll meet with a business development rep. I'll meet with an account executive, someone in that kind of pre-sales capacity, and they'll guide me through roughly the second half of that journey. Add in 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, more Gen Z, more millennials in decision-making roles, tens of millions of people getting comfortable working from home in remote and hybrid kinds of arrangements. And we're now in a place where it used to be where you would meet your prospects and clients about halfway through this process. Now they're almost ready to buy before you ever get to meet them. They're just doing so much research on their own that by the time they're ready for a conversation with an SDR, a BDR, an account executive, someone like that, in some cases, they may be just about 90% of the way through their researching, comparing options, evaluating pricing part of that journey. Gartner found that 83% of a typical buyer's journey is now over before vendor contact, before sales contact, before willingness to have a conversation with someone from your company. And that's a really big challenge, but it's also a really big opportunity for companies that want to build their name recognition. And the name recognition isn't enough for them to just recognize that you're a legit vendor in this space. In order for you to get in early now, we can't just show up the way we used to look 5 or 10 years ago, like account executives and sales development reps, business development kind of reps. We now instead need to show up as part of our most important buyer personas professional development of how they learn. So this would be kind of considered like professional development, learning and development, workforce skills development. And how do we know how to do this properly? Well, this changes the nature of who you hire into most of your commercial positions. It changes the nature of how you invest in upskilling, reskilling, retraining, cross-training people that sit in various client-facing roles within your company, because to provide the most value to your prospects and clients, and most of all, for your prospects and clients to be open to spending significant amounts of time with your client-facing team members in these early and middle stages of the journey, in these formative years, in these formative stages. It's not formative years like a child going to an adolescent, adolescent to adulthood. Maybe it's the formative weeks or formative months. In order for your prospects, your clients, your ideal buyer personas to be sufficiently motivated to want to spend time, they need to get a lot of value. And they need to get value that's way beyond what they can experience on their own with just asking questions on a search engine or chat tool or social media or YouTube or podcasts or something like that. They need to get value that's hyper specific to who they are, what they care about, and getting introduced to insights about how others in that exact same job, in similar kinds of companies, in that region, similar kinds of size, have navigated these exact kinds of initiatives, these exact kind of achieving these exact kind of goals, addressing these exact kind of challenges that are directly related to data center infrastructure, support, and optimization. And the better job you can do with that, the more likely it is that you're able to get in early and often. And it's incredibly important to not only get in early in these formative stages, but to get in often. There may be as many as 24 or more touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. So it's not enough to just have the single touch point. It's a matter of your ideal clients being motivated to want to spend significant amounts of time with your client-facing team members, subject matter experts. Some of your team members will be subject matter experts. Others will be like tour guides or concierges or hosts or moderators that bring in other internal subject matter experts from your company, or even external subject matter experts or channel partners that help to close the gaps on anything and everything having to do with data center infrastructure, support, and optimization. So at the end of the day, that's one of the most effective ways to build name recognition, brand name recognition, is to really understand who they are, who these personas are, what their biggest goals and challenges are in their own words, and then set about a very, very strong commitment to showing up early and often and producing incredibly helpful educational resources and hosting incredibly impactful educational events on all of their biggest goals and all of their biggest challenges for your prioritized buyer personas. And when you do this, they'll be motivated. They'll be motivated to not only attend, but in many cases, they're bringing along their coworkers. So you start to meet multiple people from the decision committee. Companies that learn together tend to grow together. This helps to drive very strong alignment and the important pre-sales formative stages where you have an impact to shape how they look at your category, introducing them to your methodology. You'll know this is working exceptionally well, not only because as you progress throughout your annual events calendar, you start to notice more people from each company attending together, but you start to notice that when they show up at these sales conversations, when they hit that 83% point, you start to find stakeholders in these companies that are literally quoting your methodology. It's insane, right? They got so much value learning from you that they are using your tools and resources and events as the framework for driving how they navigate this entire initiative. And that's helping to proactively drive alignment. So not only do you stay on the short list, in many cases, the value of these events are essentially knocking your competitors off of the short list, out of contention. You get to the end, you end up with a very accelerated sales cycle because you've already made all of the relationship deposits all along, and they're very bought into your way of approaching this category when it comes to infrastructure support and optimization. And there's multiple stakeholders within the same company that are all bought into this way of thinking. So this is how to go about building name recognition, brand recognition. I also caution you as well that when it comes to the phrase brand or branding, 10 years ago, it meant something quite different than what it means today. 10 years ago, branding was something that was typically owned by a creative director. And you needed like a PhD in Adobe Creative Suite to have control over the company's hexadecimal colors and the fonts, the brand guide, the logos. We're now in a place now where sure, aesthetics matters, images matter, aesthetics with videos matter, production value matters, content matters. But at the end of the day, your brand is no longer just defined by aesthetics. Your brand is everything that the marketplace says about your company and your client-facing team members when they're not in the room. And given that by default, you're not in the room for the first 83% of the journey, it is incredibly important to not accept the default, to instead say, we recognize that the new competitive battleground is getting in early and often. The new competitive battleground is in the awareness and the consideration stages of the journey, and those early to middle, in a significant percentage of those 28 touch points. And it could be as simple as a monthly, a twice a week, having something that stays with them throughout their full research and decision-making process. Because if you only meet them at the end, in most cases today, it's too late. They've already fallen in love with someone else's content. They've fallen in love with someone else's educational events experience. They're bought into their methodology, and there's virtually nothing. It's like you're talking to a wall. There's virtually nothing you can do, even lowballing and competing on price, that's going to cause them to change, because the loyalty has already been created and built by your competition getting in there early and getting there often. So if you're serious as a company specializing in data center infrastructure support and optimization about improving your name recognition, get really specific about who they are at a company level, who they are at an individual stakeholder level, what they care about, and then making it a priority coming from your C-level all the way down for the right throughout the rest of your company, that you want to be seen as the be-all end-all experts in this particular segment when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center infrastructure support and optimization. And the better job you do at that over an extended period of time, the more often you're not only going to improve your name recognition, but the more you're going to educate and build trust, the more you're going to win these deals, and you're going to win them within the right context of an ideal client who has magnificent onboarding, fantastic initial intended extended value, great land and expand, and ends up becoming a fantastic client as well as a fantastic promoter that brings all of their friends and colleagues along with them, because they're getting so much value from working with your company. But the way they learn to be great clients is it started by getting in there early and getting in there often and educating and building trust. That's how a data center infrastructure support and optimization company can improve its name recognition. What do we got next? How do wholesale data center providers differentiate? How can wholesale data center providers differentiate? That's a fantastic question. And just to make sure that we're on the same page, typically a company that is a wholesale data center provider operates within what many would consider the primary or best known category within the data center, what most well-known category within the data center ecosystem. Wholesale data center providers are typically operating adjacent to colocation data center providers, hyperscale data center providers, edge data center providers, modular data center providers, in that kind of operator category. Typically, wholesale data center providers are not that day-to-day involved in operations. That's the nature of their business. They build the shell, and someone else, either end users or colocation or hyperscale, typically purchases that shell, takes over, rents that shell, leases that shell, and they put everything inside that they want. But in terms of like purely the business model and who they're most closely aligned with, likely consider wholesale data center providers the first cousins, close relatives of colocation, hyperscale edge, and modular providers. That is a very different kind of business model than data center technology companies. Data center technology companies might be like cybersecurity, telecommunications, storage, hardware, software. We catalog 22 different kinds of data center telecommunications companies at DCSMI. There's data center facilities related companies. These are like power, cooling, physical security, commissioning, decommissioning, engineering. That would be within the facility stack. Then there's construction, real estate, and investment. So construction and real estate and investment are really very closely joined at the hip with wholesale data center providers. And in the construction ecosystem, you see like site selection experts, designers, contractors that are responsible for pulling all of this together, lobbyists that are exceptionally good with having great relationships with various community stakeholders that are more important than ever in a world that's so power constrained now and so concerned with environmental impact. So this is like having great relationships with elected officials, regulators, utility companies, even community activists can all have a significant impact on the success of any kind of many kinds of data center construction projects, especially large wholesale data center projects where you tend to be taking up more space and potentially fewer jobs, at least at the outset, until your tenants are all up and running in that facility. And then, so we talked about operators, we talked about technology and facilities companies, we talked about construction, real estate, and investment companies. And then there's outsourced sales and marketing companies. So the wholesale data center provider mostly is within kind of that pseudo operator category, although typically wholesale data center providers are not involved in much of the operations. Their tenants or tenants that they rent to would typically take over a lot of that. And then they're very closely joined at the hip with like data center developers, construction companies, REITs, real estate investment trusts, and just investors in general. So in order to properly differentiate, I think the number one strategy is to brand your wholesale data center company a lot more like someone would that's selling hyperscale or even colocation. In other words, like understand really who the most important stakeholders are that you're trying to build relationships with. In the case of a wholesale data center provider, building deep relationships with investors, institutional investors, probably not retail so much. It could be. In the world we now live in, it's very rare that a week goes by that a individual investor who's never owned data centers before will reach out to us and say, there's a plot of land that I have access or options to that I think would be perfect for a data center. Can you talk to me? It's obviously the opposite of a seasoned, sophisticated kind of buyer, as opposed to someone that's doing this with large portfolios nationally or globally. So yeah, there's investors, there's real estate related companies, there's real estate investment trusts, then there's all kinds of dozens of companies within the construction part of the ecosystem that work with wholesale data center providers. So figure out which of these stakeholders are going to be most instrumental to your success, and then pick your battles. Unless you have massive bandwidth, it's very unlikely that you're going to simultaneously be able to successfully market and sell to more than 2, 3, 4 segments at a time. It's just, if you're a really large established company, maybe you can pull this off, but in most cases, it's getting self-aware enough to recognize where you could, like win-loss analysis, where you SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, like where you think you can win most often. And then with that in mind, what are the 2, 3, 4 different kinds of segments where you need to build up your brand, where you need to generate leads, where you need to spend significant amount of time deepening these relationships within the space. So for wholesale data center providers, usually they're most concerned about the community stakeholder. Some cases, they're ranking that as the second or third most important. In other cases, they recognize that it's a non-starter if they can't get that right. And then the second part of that is typically how they're going to get that space fully rented, fully leased. So they're looking at like who's going to be the ideal tenant, who's going to rent that space. Is it going to be one huge tenant? Is it going to be 2 or 3 smaller tenants? Are they going to be end users, data center end users? Are they going to be data center operators, like a co-location kind of tenant, a co-location operator? Or are they potentially going to work with intermediaries that are going to help take care of a lot of the marketing and sales for them, which maybe in the context of like a real estate brokerage kind of firm like a CBRE or JLL or something like that, or Avocen, or depending again on where you're located, Seville's. There's a lot of different options, some huge, some global, some more regional, some more local, but there's a lot of different ways to potentially go about deciding where you're going to spend your efforts to build your brand, where you're looking to generate leads, where you're looking to nurture and that sales cycle. Typically, if you think about within data center operators, the unit economics, the lifetime value kind of runs on a spectrum where if you think about there are options within co-location that are so inexpensive that it's almost like the upper end of the range of dedicated web hosting, dedicated kind of server hosting. In the US, this is where people self-sign up and self-onboard into like co-location options that may be as little as a few $100s a month. There's plenty of co-location deals that are signed for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars a month, or your local currency equivalent. These are all typically dwarfed. These are all typically very, very small relative to the size of hyperscale deals and or wholesale deals. Typically wholesale data center deals, hyperscale deals in the US or your local currency equivalent. These are like 7-figure, 8-figure deals. They're huge, enormous deals. And because of that, your target account list is typically much smaller. It's usually a couple dozen potential clients, a couple dozen potential tenants, as opposed to hundreds or thousands. And what that means by definition is you can afford to invest a lot more in these touch points than someone that's selling commoditized colocation. So if you're looking to differentiate, it's not only getting really clear on who those couple dozen potential tenants are that are in that local area. Depending on where you're located, maybe it's a couple hundred potential tenants that may take space in that area. But then it's really figuring out, like, for these kinds of potential clients, tenants, leaseholders, whatever you want to call it, for a wholesale data center space, who is most influential in that research and decision-making process that you need to build relationships with. And again, your size, their size is going to vary tremendously. For big REITs, very common to find construction, real estate, portfolio, a whole host of finance and investment kind of professionals that are typically completely separate from technologists and facilities managers that are up and running. You'll typically find those specializations when a data center operator gets to the point that there's at least hundreds of employees, if not thousands of employees. And for an end user, add a 0 or 2 to that. These are typically, to have that kind of granular specialization, they're not small to mid-sized companies. And by the nature, at this stage of the game, with where we are in the evolution of the data center industry, those are your most likely buyers. So once you have an idea as to the job functions and job roles, then it's like any other go-to-market strategy. We're trying to figure out, we know the companies, we think we know who the stakeholders are. What do these stakeholders care most about at the intersection of making a significant real estate decision around taking space in a wholesale data center or just buying the facility outright? Like, what do they care most about? What's top of mind that's going on in their world? What are they working on individually? What's in their job description? What's in their objectives and key results? What is their team working on? Who else is on their team? What is their company working on that's directly or indirectly related to making a significant real estate related decision on wholesale data centers? And repeat this same research exercise with your secondary, your tertiary buyer persona, so you get deep customer insight into what makes them tick, what's going on in their world, having extreme empathy. Once you have that, the real way to get differentiation is to take those insights and to plow it into building a digital brand for all of the self-service buyers, which represent the majority of the people that are going to land on your doorstep. What do you mean self-service buyers? No one's buying wholesale data center space, self-service or shopping cart. Exactly. But long before they get to you, they're learning a ton about what's going on in the industry. They're learning a ton about what's going on in your geographic region. So the better job you can do at intercepting them in this learning and this research process, so you keep showing up over and over and over again, not as a pest that's trying to see how quickly you can get them into your sales process and to get them to book a meeting in that context, but as a helpful resource that exposes them to all of the different ways that they can navigate this complex decision-making process for which is the best wholesale data center company to potentially work with, partner with, buy from. And that often involves, from a practical level, creating amazingly helpful educational resources, educational events that really dialed into what they're trying to figure out professionally, and bringing in your internal subject matter experts, bringing in external subject matter experts, and thinking about building a highly granular, hyper specifically focused media and events company that's just for these couple dozen or potentially couple hundred companies and 5, 10, 15, 20 stakeholders within those companies that are going to be involved in researching and comparing options and the full life cycle of deciding what they're going to do with deciding where to locate a particular data center that they need, a data center facility that they need within prefabricate, within shell, within a wholesale data center context. So the better job you can do at that, the better job you can differentiate. And to a large degree, the better job you can do with understanding how they prioritize technology advantages like connectivity and facilities and environmental ESG kinds of advantages, sustainability advantages. It's understanding what their priorities are. What do they care about most? What does their team care about most? What does their board care about most? And then figuring out a way to adjust and personalize your approach and differentiate your approach. So you're very, very focused on what they care about most, not what you care about most. So the traditional way of approaching this is using a very real estate centric playbook. And certainly real estate has a role in all of this. But if you can intercept these potential buyers, these potential clients, anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months before they're ready for a real estate related conversation, that's your opportunity to truly differentiate. That's your opportunity to create awareness and education. That's your opportunity to educate and build trust. That's your chance to really stand out from all of the different options that are in front of them. So by the time they get to the point where they're looking at more concrete, more traditional measures of how they're going to evaluate your option compared to 5 or 10 other options that they're looking at, that you're already very deeply ingrained within that account, within that company. You already have multiple stakeholders within that company who know, like, and trust your company. That's the most impactful way that you can differentiate long before it gets to like that 87% point and they're ready for a real estate related conversation. I think one of the biggest oversights that people have in this world is they believe that their buyers still buy the same way they did 10 or 15 years ago. And the reality is most of these buyers that they're looking to build relationships with have been buyers of all kinds of other products and services and technologies over the last 5 or 10 years. And they're used to getting everything on their own terms. They're used to the self-driven kind of motion. And of course, nobody's going to buy a wholesale data center through a shopping cart experience or through a marketplace, but they're going to learn a ton about all the adjacent topics that are leading indicators that this person, that this company is going to be a buyer of wholesale data centers within the next couple of weeks or next couple of months. So play the long game, get in early, get in often, and have most or all of your client facing team members not necessarily get rid of their traditional job titles, but instead think of positioning themselves more as teachers and consultants, subject matter experts and trusted advisors. And some of the most seasoned members of your team will even look a lot more like thought leaders. So that's how a wholesale data center provider can differentiate. If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help spread the word by hitting the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic, a question, or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll be sure to add that to the consideration queue. And that brings us to our 6th and final question for this week's show, which is, how do we create a unique hyperscale data center market position? How do we create a unique data center, a unique hyperscale data center market position? That is a terrific question. And I think there's a lot of investors and data center developers that are giving this an intense amount of thought right now, because as much as it's very much a seller's market for anyone that has power capacity and is at the commissioning stage and is ready to bring hyperscale clients on board in the coming weeks and in the coming months, we're also seeing signs that it's also very, very, very competitive. And because of this, yes, ultimately there ends up being a buyer for most of these facilities. But at the end of the day, are really all buyers created equal? Are some better than others for you strategically, from a cash flow, from a financial standpoint? And are we really well insulating our companies in case there's any kind of pullback like we've seen in recently from one of the big hyperscalers? The content that we typically cover on this show is typically designed to be a little more evergreen, so I'm not going to dive into the current events of what that actually means, but there definitely has been a hyperscaler in recent months that's been pulling back a little bit on some of its options on long-term commitments. So when it comes to creating that unique market position, what gives you an unfair advantage? Is it because you're controlling the power capacity in a given region, that you have sustainable energy that no one else has? Do you have execution capability that no one else has? Do you have capital that no one else has? Do you have a brand that no one else has? What's going to give your company a unique defensible position when it comes to successfully scaling a hyperscale business? I think increasingly it's all of the above. And in recent years, what I've observed is it's become more capital intensive than ever. Not surprisingly, a lot of the smaller co-location companies that I work with as a consultant and advisor in the 2010s, most of the original founders, operators exited through mergers and acquisitions to larger co-location operators, meaning that a lot came to the conclusion that it was really hard to have a sustainable growth-oriented business with one or two or three locations. And at some point, their facilities and their client list and their team and everything became valuable enough that someone that was a little bit upstream for them that had 10 facilities or 20 facilities was rolling up more of these independent co-location operations into theirs. So it's become a lot more capital intensive. We know the facilities are bigger and more expensive than they've ever been. Power density, power scarcity is making this so it's very much driven by public capital markets in many cases, as opposed to just something that closely held, independently owned, or entrepreneurs get involved in without like a private equity or VC backed or publicly traded REIT kind of structure behind it. But creating the unique market position, this is something that largely comes down to like who you're really targeting, where you think you can win best. And it's a combination of real estate advantage. It's a combination of having power, cost-effective power in that area. It's having good fiber selection, a lot of fiber diversity in the area, so you can truly deliver on the idea of being fiber neutrality. And that's just like getting you to the shell kind of level. Then there's what are the unique operating model advantages that you have? What are you doing unique with your management platform, with your reporting? What are you doing with efficiency? Like in terms of making really, really good use of the power that you do have, what are you doing with hiring and managing and becoming a world-class place so you can attract the best talent in the industry? So at the end of the day, when it comes to creating that unique market position, is you can only be world-class in so many different areas. It's not likely that each company is going to be able to be world-class in dozens of areas. So this is something that's usually decided at the board level of where you think you can win most. And then that trickles down into chief commercial officer, business development executives, development, like real estate development executives. And then it's increasingly why I see a lot of both hyperscalers and operators merging the product and the marketing roles together. So it's increasingly common that you see like a VP of marketing / VP of product, or a chief marketing / chief product officer, because it's not only a matter of how you develop these competitive advantages, it's largely how you position them. It's how you choose to drive your messaging. It's how you choose to go to market. It's the ideal client profiles. It's the personas. It's the segmentation. It's deciding like what percentage of your resources is going to go to building a direct team. What percentage of your resources is going to go indirect with building channel partner ecosystem relationships. At the end of the day, these are very, very high level strategic decisions. And in larger data center REITs, there typically are, conservatively estimate, at least a dozen or 2 dozen people at the executive level that work on these very issues for their national or global profile. And smaller kind of hyperscalers, which may seem a little strange, are there really that many smaller hyperscalers? Usually they're startups that are aspiring to grow into much larger hyperscalers. But as with most things in the data center ecosystem, the smaller your company is, the more hats, more jobs that you'll do that would typically be divided up into multiple people or multiple teams and larger companies. But creating that unique position really depends on where you think you can win. What are your competitive advantages? What are your unfair advantages? And reverse engineering your whole go-to-market around that. If you have some degree of traction already and you know what's working, it becomes a lot easier. If you are a brand new company that's never successfully marketed hyperscale before, then a lot of what you're doing with go-to-market is you're running experiments to see where you're getting traction. But at the end of the day, the better job you can do with having more conversations with the right kinds of ideal clients and getting their feedback about what they like and dislike about what you're doing, so they give you insights as to what they think is going to work for them versus work for others. That's an incredibly important part of this. So increasingly you see the go-to-market team across marketing and sales, account management, product, channel partnerships. That alignment, the collaboration is incredibly important. The insights that sales learns needs to get fed to the rest. Products learns needs to get fed to the rest. What's learned from channel partners within ecosystems, that often has the most difficult time getting fed back to the rest of the team. But nevertheless, the channel account managers need to feed that back into the rest of the go-to-market plans and strategy, because creating that unique hyperscaler data center market position is not easy. Even among hyperscalers, even among operators, we increasingly see competitive research, competitive analysis. Nearly all, do your homework on LinkedIn, but you can look at these companies and look at the job titles in Sales Navigator. You'll see multiple people in all of these companies that are tasked with various different kinds of competitive analysis. Some of them operate at the portfolio or the real estate level. Some of them operate at the sales enablement and the marketing kind of level. But for sure, they're very, very aware that it's a hyper-competitive marketplace. These are massive deals. The smallest deals are 7 figures. In some cases, they're considerably into the 8 figures or your local currency equivalent and beyond. So getting that market positioning right is extremely important. Yeah, we're in a time where there may be a certain laid-back approach of like, hey, we have the space. We already have this competitive advantage in terms of we have space that nobody else can have. We have the lowest cost of power in the region. If they want it on the region, we're going to be the most logical place to go once we get the ear of a sophisticated buyer and the sophisticated board members and CFOs and that kind of context. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's about making these investments strategically in a way and thinking through what it really means to your portfolio, what it means to your product roadmap, what it means to your whole go-to-market. So those are the things that I would think about when it comes to creating a unique hyperscale data center market position. And then, obviously there's such massive unit economics that doing all of the normal basics that you would even for co-location become even more doable, more approachable, more important than ever. So for sure, understand who the personas are, understand in their own words what their biggest goals are, create amazingly helpful educational resources, develop all your website copywriting, your homepage, your navigation, your lead generation offers, your events, your social strategy. Everything should be all about helping your prioritized segments, your most likely prioritized segments, put your company up on a pedestal where they see that there's tremendous value that you're able to deliver that no one else can. And you're proving that over and over again, not just at the end when they're ready for that kind of real estate transactional kind of conversation, but you're staying with them throughout the full journey and influencing how they evaluate all the options. And those educational resources, those educational events are amazingly effective at getting multiple stakeholders from the same companies to show up in these contexts to make your experts a significant part of their professional development and their learning and development. And In technology and facilities companies and operator companies where the unit economics are more targeting like a small and mid-sized business, it may not be realistic to get a 10 out of 10 in all of these areas. And hyperscale deals where there's massive unit economics at stake, yeah, there's enormous abilities to do a fantastic job with this. And because of that, your competition in most cases is doing a fantastic job with these kinds of campaigns and these kinds of initiatives. So these are all areas, these are all campaigns, these are all go-to-market strategies that you should be thinking about for creating a unique hyperscale data center market position. So that's our final question that I'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've enjoyed learning some best practices and tips and strategies that you can use in your business and with other companies that you work with, make sure to hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic, a question, or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments. And if you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can subscribe. You can sign up for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, founder and CEO of the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, DCSMI, and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn, feel free to send me a connect invitation and just mention that you watch the show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. And I wish you great success in growing your professional impact, your team's impact, and your company's impact among data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. We look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.